Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Hello, I am Aisla.
And I am Eric.
And we're very excited today to introduce our guest, Emily Wu. Hello, Emily. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a privacy attorney out in Silicon Valley. I work for a prominent tech company that makes hardware for technology. And I'm really pleased to be a guest on your show.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Emily is associated through a colleague of mine, and I was talking about the recent data breaches, and Eric and I were talking about privacy and privacy matters, and Emily agreed to sort of lend some of her expertise to that conversation. And one of the things I wanted to start with is a little bit of the philosophy of privacy, something that I've heard a lot, and I think you have some really good points around this, is if you don't have anything to hide, why do you care about privacy? And I would love for you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I mean, I deal a lot with like privacy attorneys and privacy professionals, so we don't really talk about that stuff as much anymore because we assume that privacy is really important. But yeah, the whole notion of there's nothing to hide, so why do I care about privacy? I mean, just because you don't have anything to hide doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about your intimate details. I mean, it doesn't mean that you want to go out, in the middle of like a mall or something and start like, using the restroom in front of everyone, or to talk about your medical details in front of complete strangers and things of that nature. So I think that whole notion, I can understand where it's coming from, where people are like, well, I don't have a criminal background or anything like that. Why should I care? And it's like, but everybody in their day-to-day lives has things about themselves that they don't necessarily want everyone to know about, those things that we hold intimate and that kind of keep us as individuals. And so just the idea that I think it only skims like the surface of some of the information about us. It doesn't really cover like really all the things that happen, even, Monday through Friday, the weekend, what have you. And I don't think it really seriously contemplates what kind of information we could lose to the general public or to companies or to the government, so.
Yeah, I read an article and I've been trying to track it down on the psychological benefits of privacy a few years ago. There was a gentleman who was writing about how if people don't feel a sense of being able to be alone, they're less likely to risk. There's like the social norms and social pressures that we live in that create some of the social cohesion that we need also have a sort of a downside in that people conform. And so innovation and like personal expression and art and things like that can be inhibited in a society that doesn't have the benefit of privacy. So that was one of the like social and cultural benefits that I recall, but because I can't find the article, I hesitate to put that out there. But is that something that you also have seen or understand from your experience, that there's an actual, not just nothing to hide, but also there's actually value to it?
Oh, yeah. So you do kind of maintain both a sense of individuality as well as autonomy with respect to keeping certain things private. And I think that, we've all become familiar with the idea of mob mentality. And so the more and more we kind of are forced to reveal about ourselves, we end up unintentionally conforming with one another. And you just end up losing a lot of those individual identifiers or pieces of individuality through that conforming, right? So I think personally, essentially, like we, should value those things that kind of make us individuals and keep those things to ourselves, so to speak, because otherwise, like when you have companies that kind of like take a lot of that information for the purposes of social media, you'll even see it on like Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. You'll notice that like more and more people who use it and are kind of exposed to it end up kind of becoming the same type of thing. Like people will pose in the same way and show off the same things. And that in and of itself is kind of like a loss of identity and a loss of individuality. So I really think that's important to keep and maintain with, being able to protect all of that private data.
Yeah, well, and you just...
Does that make sense?
It does, and you just brought up an interesting word, one that I find myself in a love-hate relationship with, which is Facebook, because people are now becoming aware that, Facebook's customers are not them. Facebook's customers are the people that Facebook sells all this information about the users to, and we're finding out, we find out that they have their own data breaches, or they were indiscriminate with the way they were sharing information. Turns out they gave access to people's private messages to, companies like Spotify and Netflix.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've always lived in this philosophy of like anything you put on the internet, just expect that everyone can see it. But people don't tend to actually live in that world. They don't think that way.
Right. It's become so comfortable, I think, that people really forget what they put out there. And even the fact that companies like Facebook are tracking not just what you put out there publicly, that or it's getting plastered on somebody else's wall, but your behaviors online as well. Like if you pause to look at one news article over another, they already get a whole bunch of data about you and what your preferences are just from the pause, And it is troubling. And I think that among privacy professionals, there's this rise of what is now known as data ethics or big data ethics. And so it's kind of about how companies should morally, make decisions and treat data, especially when they get such a large bulk of data about so many people. And I think one of the things that is the most troubling about this whole Facebook situation, especially with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, is that, we saw a company that had a ton of data and they kind of indiscriminately gave it away to third parties that were their customers, us being the product, of course.
Yeah.
And from that, they're able to change election results, essentially. They're able to start political movements that could topple over governments.
And that's not even talking about the manipulation from Russia and things like that, right? This was all pretty normal usage of data without even the psychological manipulation factor.
Exactly.
I was reading
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I was saying I was reading a commentary from a gentleman who was saying that there was this sort of quote unquote reassuring attempt to say, oh no, like Facebook doesn't listen to your conversations. They happen to be able to predict your data, your behavior because of their data. And he was talking about how he and a friend had been talking about some new product that he was interested in. And like the next day it showed up in his Facebook feed. And he said, and that's when I decided to quit Facebook, not because they're listening to my conversations. They're not. It's just that because they have so much data on me, they can actually predict what I'm interested in talking to my friend about. And he said, and that's terrifying. Like people put that out there as reassuring. Oh, no, they're not listening. That's not reassuring.
Right, exactly. Even if you have, like, let's say you and your friend are just talking about stuff and you're both carrying cell phones, like that cell phone data has like your precise geolocation, and then your friend goes and starts Googling something about like candles or whatever, they already know. They're like, oh, they must be talking together because they're near each other and one's Googling about candles. So that means the other one might also be interested in those products. So we're going to start pushing ads on it. And so it's as if they're listening and they're still getting that data about you. And I think what scared me was when we were going through those congressional hearings, when they were asking Mark Zuckerberg stuff, One thing that scared me was that our congressmen don't really have any idea about this type of technology. They're very novice at it. And they don't know what's going on. They kind of have I don't even know if they have a basic understanding of it. So that was one terrifying thing. But the other thing that I found terrifying was the realization that even if you don't sign up for a product like Facebook, they're still building a profile about you because of all the things that you already do online. So unless you like live in a log cabin and aren't online or on phones or anything, I mean, they're already collecting information about you. They already know who you are.
Yeah. Well, and so kind of near and dear to my heart, you're in Silicon Valley. I work for a tech startup based in Silicon Valley, but we have an office here in Colorado. But yeah, we're a good old fashioned Palo Alto company. And what we do is we make a web development platform. So we build a platform for people to build websites on. Makes us a lot less culpable in this because, to be honest, about the worst thing we generally deal with is phishing sites built on our platform. And, we'll get cease and desist notifications to shut those kinds of things down. But in reality, like, I've seen firsthand how some of this stuff can get abused just by the customers that I deal with. And again, it's a platform that they're using to build websites, but one aspect that's really caught my attention, you kind of alluded to this, is geofencing. And I've heard a lot about this. You've got these companies now that are trying to figure out, based on your phone location, if you're in the emergency room, so they can start sending you accident attorney information immediately. And it feels so violating to think that that's a possibility.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really creepy and it's super intrusive. And I feel like it's kind of in the same way, we would feel if someone were out there stalking us, and kind of following our every move and watching us when we eat dinner and things of that nature. I mean, it gets to that level of intrusion and most people I don't think about it because they're just using their cell phone or they're using this free product they found online, like some application or something. And they don't realize that the reason it's free is because it's being paid for by these companies that are farming that data.
Nothing's free.
Right?
Nothing is free.
Except a free lunch, right?
Free.
Yeah.
So one other thing, and we were talking about this right before we began the show, GDPR. So, it's a good entryway into kind of, you're talking about data ethics.
Can you actually say what those words are?
You probably remember it. I've been saying the acronym since February of last year.
Sorry. General Data Protection Regulation. It's really interesting. It has actually a really interesting background. Europe does consider privacy a fundamental human right, and it arose from a long history of legislation. There was a directive that came before it even, and it's there to kind of normalize and regulate or become a regulation across all of the EU members. What's really interesting, and I don't think a lot of people know about this, but the history of why this law arose actually stems all the way back to the effects resulting from the Nazis in Germany and World War II. And that is because a lot of the ways in which the Nazis were able to kind of isolate and pinpoint Jewish households as well as other minorities is by taking the census data that they collected. They would go door to door and collect information about all the households within Germany. And then from that data, they would pull a list of, candidates, I guess you could say, where they could go ahead and discriminate against them. And they'd also pool the companies in Germany to do the same. So a lot of that personal information about what ethnicity you are, what religion you practice, and all of that, even trade union memberships, all came into play during that time. And so that's why these types of laws kind of started arising, was to protect that and from never letting that happen again. And then they also looked towards Silicon Valley as kind of being this this area where there's like a ton of technology that's being invented, and one technology is piggyback off of another and all of this. And so they were really worried that there is a chance where we have a bunch of companies that have a ton of information about us, and it could be used to, harm us and discriminate against us, which, I mean, honestly is kind of happening, like we talked about with like the recent elections. And I know internationally there have been a lot of elections that have been affected, and then all that psychological manipulation with the Russian involvement in our past, like 2016 election. So, it's a very real fear, and it's understandable why they come up with such a heavy, very deeply thought out framework and regulation, because they want to protect us from having the Nazis kind of happen all over again.
Right. Well,
can you go into some details on like what sorts of things that law actually covers? Like, again, I'm familiar with things because our platform, we had to build it. We had to make some adjustments to it to make sure it was able to be compliant, but, and then our own company compliant. But maybe you can go over some of the just top level details.
Sure. So essentially, it's a framework that's based on a number of different principles, such as like data minimization and accountability and things of that nature. And what it does is it basically demands that companies do certain things to protect the data. They have to have security safeguards and technological safeguards in place. They have to use tools to protect private information, such as encryption. They, need to go about treating the data very, carefully in certain respects. And they also have to honor the rights of individuals. And those rights can include the right to be forgotten, in other words, having the data deleted, or the right to be able to access your data or change and correct that data. So it gives individuals all in Europe the right to do certain things with their personal information that companies hold. It also helps companies remain accountable. So if I give you, or my company gives your company data, then we have an expectation of certain things that you have already in place, and that, you won't deviate from the instructions I provide to you for the purposes of treating that data in certain ways. So it's pretty overarching. It's all principle based. There's not a ton of like detail as like you have to use this level of encryption or anything like that. It's up to the companies to decide that. But it is there to fundamentally protect those rights of those individuals.
And it sounds like the consequences of not doing it well are pretty significant. Like something.
Oh yeah.
Intense fines and.
Yeah, you get up to like 4% of your company's global turnover. So it's not just for Europe; it would be for the company's overall revenue for the prior year. So that can range in the hundreds of millions of dollars for some companies.
Yeah, I felt like it was definitely like the fines were of a scope to target the obvious people like Google, Facebook, and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's really well, and also.
Oh yeah, I mean. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying like that. Like that's an incentive, when you have profit-based companies, if their profits are going to get genuinely hit, then the cost analysis, let's do this well. So it seems like they really created a good structure for this.
Yeah, and I think it had a lot to do with the fact that, in prior years before the GDPR, they would like issue fines against companies and there'd be a cap. And company like Google, like a big company doesn't care about those types of fines, so they're not going to do anything, right? So they wanted to make sure that the fines for the GDPR really had a bite to them.
Yeah. So something you mentioned earlier that I think is really important is you talked about data ethics. And, from my perspective, this technology isn't going away. And this is, or at least not anytime soon. And so... And in order, as you said, like if you want to participate in the global experience in terms of social or economic contributions and interactions, you're going to be part of, Google or Facebook or something. And so instead of railing against it, how do we normalize principle-based behavior? And, just like any technology comes with its downsides, and then there needs to be some adjustments socially for that? It sounds to me like maybe data ethics is the legal or philosophical approach to normalizing perhaps behaviors that counter some of the downsides. And so I'm just curious, like, is that something that is primarily amongst lawyers, or is it, would it be a legislative thing? Are there other movements? Are there movements in America around technology-based data ethics that you're aware of?
I don't know if there's like actual legislation with regards to data ethics, but just because of the fact that GDPR hit and it was so impactful, we do see a lot of other legislation globally and even in the U.S. that's been added and been enacted. So one example would be the California Consumer Privacy Act. And I, have my own personal qualms with that. It's difficult to operationalize, but at the heart of it, again, is just this notion that we need to give people the right to know what's being done to their data, who it's being sold to, what's going on with the data, what type of third parties have access to it. And so it has a lot of requirements put in place for that. And in a lot of ways, California has a tendency to do these things first and other states follow. And so I think stemming from that, there's also been a lot of talk about whether the U.S. is going to have a federal privacy law. And a lot of companies, honestly, are actually all for it. And I agree with them to some extent, too, because when you have like 50 states, it's difficult to do everything you need to do to be in compliance with all 50 if the requirements are different. So to comply with a federal law would be a lot easier. But we also see other countries as well, like Brazil came up with their own version of GDPR. I think Argentina is looking at binding corporate rules, which is something that's kind of European based as like a good, transfer mechanism for personal information outside of the country, stuff like that. So we're definitely going to see a lot of regulations that come about abroad as well as in the U.S. That's going to be very similar to what GDPR does.
So far, we've actually kind of been focusing on what people are doing with our information that we're willingly putting out there and maybe not willingly sharing, and they are. But there's another aspect to this, and that's when the companies are unwillingly sharing information, i.e. getting hacked and data breaches and things like that, which is a whole nother aspect because, I mean, it's the endless cat and mouse game of, companies raise security to a certain point, people figure out the security, and they continue to raise security. But, I don't hear about it as much, and I don't feel like that's for any reason other than the fact that it's become more normalized, but identity theft is still a thing.
Definitely.
Well, you have your own story on that.
Yeah, I actually recently experienced identity theft, and it probably arose from one of the more recent breaches that we've had. And so like my name, address, phone number, social security number, all of that was taken. And there's like a rush of applications to various credit cards that I had to go chase down. I had to call my own credit card companies, like especially store credit cards, because they could just go into a store, claim to be me, and the only check that they'll have is like, well, what's your social security number, or what's the last 4 digits of your social security and your birthday? And so it was really easy for them to just start charging like thousands of dollars of stuff in my name. And fortunately, at least for me, I caught it in time because I was getting some weird notifications and started calling around and found out all of this. And so I've been really carefully monitoring my credit card statements and stuff like that, and not taking some of those things for granted as spam. So fortunately, I was able to kind of nip it in the bud. But that's something I would definitely say for everybody out there, especially this holiday season or this past holiday season, is that you definitely want to watch your credit card statements and make sure that that stuff hasn't been basically attacked or anything, because it's easy to kind of fall into that. It's not like I lost a credit card or left something like my driver's license out or anything like that. I'm very protective of that stuff, but we give all this stuff to companies, even like the companies that are supposed to protect our credit information.
I know, yeah.
They get hacked. And so, yeah. So
that's like the biggest
that.
betrayal ever, is that the company that, should be monitoring this stuff is the one that gets hacked last year.
I signed up for Credit Karma. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. And they seem to be pretty transparent about how they do it. They're like, they monitor your credit score, and they also tell you if there's a breach attached to, I shouldn't say they tell you if there's breaches and suggest that you look into it. And they're like, how do we make money with our free service? We recommend these products to you that we think you'll like based on what we know about you. But we don't tell the companies that information. We have so I've been pretty satisfied with them. And I get an email once a week that's like, your credit score has gone up 5 points or, whatever. But just a couple of days ago, I got an email that said, it's possible that these 2 breaches affected you. You should go check on that. And so I felt like that was helpful. And I'm not, once again, it's another place for my data to be, but I felt like it was a helpful service in that way.
I even went one step further, and it's a very double-edged sword, but I had my credit locked. So essentially no new accounts can be opened, except for when I wanted to purchase a new computer and was going to sign up for an Apple credit card, and it turned into a day of trying to call all of the right people to unlock it to open a new account. I mean, it's like, well, at least nobody can start an account
because you can barely do it,
right? Because it was hard for me to do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is the sort of the Bicurian moment in this whole thing is the tension between the efficiency of our data being out there. I'll be honest, I love it. I love that my computer syncs with my phone, syncs with my tablet, syncs with my Google Assistant. And I love the convenience of it. I'm a huge technophile. If I had unlimited money, I'd have unlimited gadgets. And I'm so into it. And I'm kind of a privacy hound. Like, I don't like to share and I don't like the vulnerability that exists, but I still use Facebook. I still put stuff out there. And I feel like that's a tension of the difference, the tension between security and efficiency and connection. Like there are some things about Facebook that I hate. And then I also really love that, friends of mine from college that I haven't seen in 10 years, we still chat. I know what's going on in their lives. And so, once again, I think we're going to have to find new solutions to this new influence of this new technology. And I know, like, my friend lived in Korea, which is significantly more populated than the United States. And people there, or maybe there's also a better example, like India, which is also highly populated. And there was a quote, maybe it was Gandhi, who said, like, while many people are naked, you don't look at it. Like they've learned how to be right up in each other's business without actually getting into each other's business. Like they have social structures in terms of their interactions to create privacy when they're all kind of piled on top of each other in these densely populated areas. And I just wonder if there's something to be learned from that around how we're using this technology to learn how not to assume invitation just from a social side, not just the companies and their exploitation, but the people and how that works.
That's an interesting point. I was also thinking about China because I just learned recently, like China uses a really popular messaging app that does a whole bunch of things. It's called WeChat. And what's really interesting is that the Chinese government went kind of like the other way with things. And now they use their WeChat ID as like a national ID, like you would your social security number.
Yeah, I heard about this.
And on top of that, they're now starting to implement what's called like a social score, where they, based on like whether or not you're not just a good citizen, but that you're always like, I don't know, like sociable and popular and things of that nature, they will judge whether or not you're worthy of credit and other things. So it kind of went like completely like Black Mirror.
That's really terrifying.
Things, right?
It is terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, okay, well, I think one thing I found also really interesting is like the younger generations, because I'm like, a Gen Xer or whatever, but like those folks are actually looking at technologies that do more with like the temporariness of things. Like, Snapchat's kind of like the most popular version maybe, but they either look at stuff like Snapchat where the messages don't theoretically last forever, even though I think they do. And then you've got like stuff like Discord where you're only talking with your select group of friends and it's not going beyond that. So there are ways in which I think they've kind of adapted to this whole social networking environment where they're trying to minimize it in like these other types of technologies that people like us don't really do as much of.
Yeah, they're trying to make it work for them instead of having them work for it.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, I feel like China's like the dystopian future for all of us based on like what the government's doing with their social networking stuff and social IDs and everything.
Yeah, that I hope that does not take off and that we can all just sort of watch and learn how bad that actually is.
So
if we're lucky.
Yeah. So as we're wrapping up here, do you have any suggestions for people or words of wisdom, favorite quotes?
I think the main thing is that people just need to be more aware of what they have out there. I think there's just so much out there. And there are various tools that each of these platforms use. Like I know Facebook has its privacy dinosaur and with it a full suite of tools and everything to kind of downplay the amount of information that they're collecting, but also just keep in mind, like, just be aware of like, your credit statements and all of that stuff. And, you can even go to the extreme of like using throwaway or email addresses when you sign up for stuff. But yeah, just kind of the awareness is, I think, the first step to all of this. Getting more social and cultural awareness of what we're doing with our information, I think is the most important step.
That sounds like great advice, and I definitely would encourage everybody to just pay attention, just know what's going on.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
So my Bicurian moment, which I think we're going to share,
Yes.
is specifically Rick and Morty, which is a cartoon, and more generally this concept of the new version of cartoons that is out there. I would say for me that it started actually with BoJack Horseman. My son really wanted me to watch it with him, and I did, because I'll do things for my kids that I won't do for any other reason. And I found myself really being impressed with the writing and the themes and the satire and the social and political commentary. And I really had to reevaluate. And I had resisted Rick and Morty. It just grossed me out when I'd walk into the living room and someone would be watching it, one of my kids would be watching it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what is this? And then I met you, and you were like, it's one of my favorite shows. And I'm like, well, you have so many other things about you that seem so intelligent. I don't know why you're into that. And I think some of it was I had a sort of a reflex that, cartoons are something I did when I was a kid. Like, even though I liked animated movies, there was something about the TV shows that was like juvenile to me.
Right.
Rick definitely seemed quite juvenile when I caught him on the screen. And there's a way in which I didn't relate to the medium. I don't know what that was, but it just didn't quite invite me in.
Yeah.
And then between both my kids really being into it, and I do actually respect their judgment, and then you constantly talking about how much you liked it, and then this other friend of mine who was wearing a Rick and Morty t-shirt, and he said, he goes, you have to get past the first couple episodes. It's really, really well done. and quite intelligent. I'm like, how is some old guy walking around with vomit on his lips going to be intelligent? And I now have 4 people who I really respect in terms of their ways that they go about life and their interest in art and their like judgment about things, telling me it's a valuable show. So I guess I'm going to sit down and watch it. And I've been unbelievably impressed.
I think some of the most intelligent writing going on right now happens to be coming out in animated form. Um, for me, I think it started with more adult-oriented animated things. Futurama grabbed my attention early on, and I thought they covered things in a funny and interesting way that would have been hard to do live action. And and then you actually get some of the depth of these things that are fantastical, but that's why the animated medium works for it, because they get you to buy into certain things that, again, if it was being shot live action, would be tougher to deal with.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things I love about like fantasy and science fiction is that the ways that people can imagine a dystopian future or create a metaphor for something that's happening, a lot of times we're too close. So we can't see the intensity of something we're just used to it. And when you step back, like we were talking about the WeChat thing in China, and then after we ended the show with Emily, we talked about that episode in the Orville where they took it to the next level, and there was this whole planet that had social media as a judgment. You could die if your social media score was too low. And taking a step back or into the absurd kind of allows you to recognize that, oh, there's some things here we maybe want to question. And it seems to me like the cartoons are doing that in another way.
They are, and it's kind of ironic because that is a Seth MacFarlane show. The Orville, if anyone hasn't seen it, I do highly recommend it if you're a fan of Star Trek and you want to see a little bit of a spoof on it. But it's oddly deep, too. But Seth MacFarlane, of course, is the person behind Family Guy, American Dad, and all of these other animated shows.
Yeah.
And this is his first foray into a show where he's doing it live action, and it has that feel of what a lot of these animated shows have done. And in some regards, it works. And in other regards, there's little parts of me that sit around and say, man, if they had animated this, they could do some things for effect that don't always carry over. So, I think there's a place for all of that kind of thing, but arbitrarily discounting animation, I think, is kind of you're limiting yourself from a lot of different kinds of experiences.
I would say I was being closed-minded and judgmental. And I feel sufficiently, I wouldn't say no one's chastised me, penitent. I feel sufficiently penitent for my poor attitude, and I am working to make up for it by watching all of these animated shows so I can be culturally relevant.
Well, that sounds like a positive step. So my Bikerian moment does kind of tag along with this, and that is that on the one hand, I do love these shows, but in the case of characters such as Rick, he's really an anti-hero. And I have heard tale, especially involving McDonald's releasing Szechuan sauce, which if you had seen the show, you'd understand a show becoming popular enough to make McDonald's feel compelled to release a sauce from the late 90s for dipping your chicken nuggets in. That
Now I want chicken nuggets.
so there was some cases of people being angry and emulating Rick in what they would expect his anger to be when the stores ran out of this. And it occurs to me that I think this is across media right now in general. I can't think of a show going where any of the characters are particularly lovable other than the fact that they might remind you of your old racist grandpa or something. I like the characters, I like the comedy, but I certainly do not want to be a lot of these. And we are living in a world where I'm now rating shows like, is there anyone on this show that's remotely redeemable? But that is where we're at. And I don't know if it's a reflection of the realism of the world. I've had somebody make an argument to me about that. Or just the fact that we like watching car crashes. I mean,
Well, it's interesting in that I do feel like we've reached a point in media where the flawed character, we're not looking for the unflawed hero anymore. And there could be some emotional maturity in that. And maybe, there could be not, there's a lot to the psychology of media and archetypes. I do know that recently when I was watching Rick and Morty, the episode, he was being particularly vile and yet also highly competent. And it's something that, I experienced in my world is that conundrum of this person is kind of vile, and yet their competence requires that I work with them. They are able to do something valuable or important that while my experience with them is awful, their impact on so many other people is going to be so positive that I'm willing to deal with it. I'm willing to deal with the vileness. And Rick accidentally does things that are genuinely helpful. It's just his intent doesn't ever seem to be really doing anything nice for anybody. And I think that's a reality that we all have had to deal with. We have to work with people who treat us badly or interact with people who are kind of vile, and we do it for the greater good, for our family, for the impact they have. And I don't see that changing.
Well, and this actually can go a little bit deeper, because there's that old adage that the world is filled with normal people until you get to know them. And then you realize that they're not normal.
Mhm.
They don't have a good relationship with their ex, or, they're
That's
not.
pretty normal, though.
Yeah, like, but I mean, like all of these things, like, or, they're broken from a bad relationship. Everybody has these stories, right? But when you're going through the grocery store and you see a couple walking down the aisle grabbing things, they're just normal people, right?
Yeah.
Not people that, are dealing with things. And so these shows dig into this real family life, and it does feel real. And I think you can actually you can commiserate in some ways, and you can see those things, and we do. I mean, we do that all the time. We've done our episodes on, family dinners and how to avoid arguments and things like that. But realistically, what are we talking about there? We're talking about dealing with humans,
Yeah.
being humans. And in some ways, maybe it's not bad that media is normalizing that humans are humans.
Yeah.
Like, normal isn't normal. We outgrew Leave It to Beaver.
Right. And I think there's something in that is helpful for people to realize that there isn't some idealized family situation that you're just missing out on. We actually are all dealing with our mutual dysfunctions and wounds and attempts to do well that may or may not go the way we're hoping. And I think there's some value in that. And then also some value in calling it out in a, satire. It's like the court jester. We need the jester to mock the king.
It's true, yeah. And I think satire is something that we are desperately in need of right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what we have for our show today. Thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are Bicurian on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or give us a call at 720-507-7309 or email podcast@bicurian.com.
And if you like what we are doing, please tell your friends about us and share the episodes that you find most interesting.
Thank you so much and have a great week.